You've probably heard the story. Open an ancient tomb, disturb the pharaoh's rest, and within weeks you're dead under mysterious circumstances. It's been in countless movies, TV shows, and books. But here's what nobody tells you about the so-called curse of the pharaohs. Almost everything you think you know about it is a complete lie invented by newspapers desperate for a good story. Look, I'm not saying ancient Egypt wasn't obsessed with protecting their tombs. They absolutely were. But the idea that mystical curses were killing archaeologists left and right, that's pure fiction. And today, we're going to tear apart one of history's most famous hoaxes and show you exactly how it happened. So let's go back to 1922. Howard Carter is standing in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, and he's about to make the discovery of a lifetime. After years of searching, funded by Lord Carnarvon, he finds the tomb of King Tutankhamun. This tomb is different from anything they've seen before because it's almost completely intact. Most pharaoh tombs had been robbed thousands of years ago, but not this one. Carter makes a small hole in the door and holds up a candle to peek inside. Lord Carnarvon asks him what he can see, and Carter gives one of the most famous replies in archaeology. Wonderful things. And he wasn't lying. The tomb was packed with gold, furniture, chariots, and the mummy of the young king himself. Now the tomb is opened in November 1922, and the world goes absolutely crazy over it. Newspapers everywhere are printing stories about the treasures. People can't get enough of it. Ancient Egypt was already fascinating to the public, but this discovery took it to another level entirely. Then something happens. In April 1923, just a few months after the tomb is opened, Lord Carnarvon dies in Cairo. He's only 57 years old. The cause? Blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite that he accidentally cut open while shaving. He develops pneumonia and dies. And this is where things get weird. Not because of any actual curse, but because of what the newspapers did next. A writer named Marie Corelli sends a letter to the press claiming she owns an ancient Arabic text that warns of dire punishment for anyone who enters a sealed tomb. She says Lord Carnarvon's death proves the curse is real. Now, did this text actually exist? Probably not. But nobody cared because the story was too good. Then the newspapers just run wild with it. They start calling it the curse of Tutankhamun or the mummy's curse. Every single article is more dramatic than the last. Some papers claim that at the exact moment Lord Carnarvon died, all the lights in Cairo went out. Others say his dog back in England howled and dropped dead at the same moment. These stories spread like crazy, and suddenly everyone believes in the curse. But here's the thing. None of this stuff actually happened. The lights in Cairo didn't go out. Power outages were super common in Cairo at the time, so even if they did, it wouldn't mean anything. And the story about the dog? Completely made up. But truth didn't matter when you had newspapers competing for sales. The media keeps pushing this narrative, and they start looking for more victims of the curse. Every time someone connected to the tomb dies, no matter how loosely connected or how much time has passed, the newspapers scream, "The curse strikes again." Let me give you some examples of how ridiculous this got. Arthur Mace, an archaeologist who helped open the tomb, died in 1928. The newspapers blamed the curse. But Mace had been sick with pleurisy for years before the tomb was even discovered. He was already dying. George J. Gould, an American financier who visited the tomb, died a few months after his visit. Curse, right? Wrong. The guy was already seriously ill when he traveled to Egypt, and he died of pneumonia, which he probably would have gotten whether he visited a tomb or not. Then there's Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, who was supposedly cursed after visiting the tomb. He was shot by his wife in a hotel in London. Yeah, that had nothing to do with any curse. That was just a murder. The newspapers would connect absolutely anyone to the curse if it sold papers. Someone's cousin's friend saw a picture of the tomb. Curse victim. Someone walked past the museum where the artifacts were displayed. Curse victim. It got completely out of hand. But here's what the newspapers conveniently ignored. Howard Carter, the guy who actually discovered the tomb and spent years working inside it, lived until 1939. That's 17 years after opening the tomb. If anyone was going to be cursed, it would be him. But nope, he died of natural causes at age 64. Dr. Douglas Derry, who performed the autopsy on King Tut's mummy, lived until 1961. That's almost 40 years after the tomb was opened. Harry Burton, the photographer who documented everything inside the tomb, lived until 1940. Alfred Lucas, the chemist who preserved the artifacts, lived until 1945. In fact, a study was done in 2002 by Mark Nelson, published in the British Medical Journal. He actually tracked down everyone present when the tomb was opened and calculated their survival rates. Want to know what he found? The people who entered the tomb lived just as long on average as people who didn't. There was absolutely no statistical difference. The curse didn't exist. So why were newspapers so obsessed with pushing this story? Money, plain and simple. The 1920s was the golden age of newspapers, and they were all competing for readers. A boring headline like, "Archaeologist dies of natural causes" doesn't sell papers. But Ancient Curse Kills Again absolutely does. And there's something else going on here too. This was happening during a time when Egypt was fighting for independence from British colonial rule. The British and other Western powers had been coming to Egypt for decades, taking artifacts and shipping them back to museums in Europe and America. A lot of Egyptians weren't happy about this, and honestly, who can blame them? The curse narrative, in a weird way, became a kind of symbolic resistance. It was like Egypt itself was fighting back against the people who were stealing its history. Of course, this wasn't actually happening, but the idea resonated with people. It gave power to Egypt in the story, even if that power was fictional. Now let's talk about what ancient Egyptians actually believed about tomb protection, because they did take it seriously, just not in the way Hollywood shows you. Ancient Egyptians absolutely believed in protecting their tombs and the afterlife of the deceased. They would include prayers and spells in tombs, written on the walls or on papyrus, that were meant to help the dead person in the afterlife. These are called the pyramid texts or the Book of the Dead, depending on the time period. Some tombs do have warnings written on them. These warnings typically say things like, "As for anyone who shall enter this tomb, I will seize him like a bird. He will be judged for it by the great God." But here's the key thing. These warnings were meant to protect the tomb from robbers by scaring them, and they were believed to work through the gods, not through some automatic supernatural mechanism. It's like putting a "Beware of Dog" sign on your fence. You're trying to deter people, but the sign itself isn't going to bite anyone. The ancient Egyptians believed the gods would punish tomb robbers, not that the tomb itself had some magical death ray built into it. And another important point, King Tut's tomb didn't even have these warnings. There was no inscription saying, "Death shall come on swift wings to he who disturbs the peace of the king," or anything like that. That's completely made up. People think that was in Tut's tomb because of movies, but it never existed. So where did the modern idea of mummy curses come from, if not from actual Egyptian beliefs? You can trace it back to European literature in the 1800s. As Egypt became more accessible to Western tourists and archaeologists, people back home became fascinated with ancient Egypt. Writers started creating Gothic horror stories, featuring mummies coming back to life or cursing people. One of the earliest examples is a story called The Mummy's Soul from 1827. Then you've got Jane Webb Loudon's The Mummy from 1827, which features a reanimated mummy. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, mummy stories were everywhere in popular fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes, even got involved. After Lord Carnarvon died, Doyle suggested that maybe there were ancient poisons or microbes deliberately placed in the tomb to kill intruders. He was trying to give a scientific explanation for the curse, but it was still nonsense. This brings up an interesting question, though. Could there have been something dangerous in the tomb that wasn't supernatural? Could there have been some kind of bacteria or fungus that made people sick? Scientists have actually looked into this. There is something called tomb mold or various fungi that can grow in sealed environments over thousands of years. Some species of Aspergillus, a type of fungus, can cause respiratory problems in people with weakened immune systems. In very rare cases, it can be serious. But here's the thing. This wasn't what killed Lord Carnarvon or anyone else. Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite and pneumonia, not from inhaling fungal spores. And if toxic mold was really the issue, you'd expect everyone who entered the tomb to get sick. Not just a few random people years apart. There's also been speculation about radiation or other exotic explanations, but there's zero evidence for any of this. The simplest explanation is that people died because people die, especially in the 1920s when medical care wasn't what it is today and people didn't have antibiotics. The idea of the curse got cemented into popular culture through movies. Universal Studios released The Mummy in 1932, starring Boris Karloff, and it was a massive hit. In this movie, a mummy comes back to life after archaeologists disturb his tomb, and he goes on a killing spree. This movie created the template that's been used hundreds of times since then. Every few years, Hollywood releases another mummy movie with the same basic plot. Someone opens a tomb, ignores the warnings, and supernatural bad things happen. The 1999 version with Brendan Fraser is probably the most famous recent example, but there have been so many others. These movies are fun entertainment, but they've completely warped how people understand ancient Egypt. Most people genuinely believe that curse inscriptions were common in tombs, that archaeologists routinely died mysterious deaths, and that ancient Egyptians had some kind of supernatural power to strike down their enemies from beyond the grave. None of this is true. It's actually kind of frustrating for Egyptologists because they have to constantly fight against these misconceptions. They're trying to teach people about the real, fascinating history of ancient Egypt, but everyone just wants to know about the curses and the zombies. Real ancient Egypt is so much more interesting than the Hollywood version. These were people who built massive architectural wonders, developed complex religious and philosophical systems, created beautiful art, and built a civilization that lasted for thousands of years. They had advanced mathematics, medicine, and engineering. But instead of talking about that, we're stuck discussing whether or not they could magically kill people from beyond the grave. Let's also address something else about the curse narrative that's kind of messed up. It often portrays Egyptians as primitive, superstitious people who were so afraid of death that they put evil magic spells everywhere. This is a really unfair characterization. Ancient Egyptians weren't any more superstitious than ancient Greeks, Romans, or any other ancient culture. They had sophisticated religious beliefs that made sense within their worldview. The fact that they believed in an afterlife and wanted to protect their dead doesn't make them weird or scary. Lots of cultures do this. The curse narrative also takes away Egyptian agency in a weird way. It suggests that the only way Egyptians could protect their heritage was through supernatural means, not through their own actions or institutions. It's a very colonial way of looking at things. Today, Egypt has laws protecting archaeological sites and cultural heritage. They have trained archaeologists and conservators. They have museums and educational programs. That's the real way heritage gets protected, not through magic curses that don't exist. But the curse myth refuses to die, pun intended. Even today, whenever there's a news story about a new Egyptian discovery, or when a museum exhibit opens, you'll see headlines asking about curses. It's become such a part of the cultural mythology around ancient Egypt that it's almost impossible to separate the two. There have been TV documentaries that claim to investigate the curse scientifically, but they're really just entertainment, disguised as education. They'll interview people who say they felt weird after visiting a tomb, or they'll talk about coincidences and try to make them seem significant. It's the same tabloid journalism from the 1920s, just with better production values. The irony is that by focusing so much on fake curses, we're ignoring the real challenges facing Egyptian archaeology. Climate change, urban development, looting, and lack of funding are all serious threats to ancient sites. These are the real curses, but they're not as exciting as a mummy's revenge, so they don't get as much attention. So what have we learned here? The Egyptian curse is not historical horror. It's Hollywood fiction built on a foundation of sensational newspaper reporting from the 1920s. It was created to sell papers and movie tickets, and it worked incredibly well. So well that 100 years later, people still believe it. Lord Carnarvon died from a mosquito bite and pneumonia, not from a curse. The other supposed victims of the curse either died from unrelated causes, were already sick, or lived long, healthy lives. Howard Carter, who actually discovered the tomb and spent more time in it than anyone else, lived for 17 years after the discovery with no issues whatsoever. Ancient Egyptians did want to protect their tombs, and they used religious warnings to try to scare off robbers, but they didn't have magical death powers. King Tut's tomb specifically didn't even have warning inscriptions. The whole curse narrative was invented by Western writers and journalists who saw a good story and ran with it. The real story of King Tut's discovery is actually amazing, without any need for supernatural elements. It's a story about persistence, archaeological skill, and an incredible stroke of luck. It's about discovering a window into the past and learning about a civilization that thrived thousands of years ago. That's the story we should be telling. Next time you see a movie or TV show about mummy curses, enjoy it for what it is: entertainment. But don't confuse it with history. The real ancient Egypt doesn't need fake curses to be interesting. It's plenty fascinating on its own. If you want to see more myths like this one torn apart, hit that subscribe button.